Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Art of Protection, where the author and I discuss all things relating to close protection, utilizing designated, incidental, and counterintelligence. In this episode, I asked Michael about teamwork, negotiation skills, team medics, how we ensure that intel remains current, what qualities do we look for, communication and interpersonal skills, why does the security industry have a bad reputation, dealing with difficult principles, walking drills, roles within the security team, and lastly, ineffective leadership. I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Welcome back. So today we're going to touch on a few different topics that you talk about in the book. Obviously, book number 3, The Art of Protection. So tell us about teamwork, how important it is.
Teamwork is a funny thing. I'll be honest with you. Personally, I like to work on my own. I'm just one of those people that feel, though perhaps quite arrogantly, that I'm better working on my own. But I also have to, during the training programs, instill this idea of positive teamwork.
Yeah.
A close protection team will always work better when there's good cohesion, when everyone's getting along. It requires, acceptance of different styles and preferences and all the rest of it. It's an important attribute, I think, of a CPO to be able to work as part of a team.
Yeah.
It's also, sometimes quite challenging. In order to enforce positive teamwork, it's going to require positive communication, interpersonal skills and all the rest of it. But ultimately, if everyone sort of focuses on the job at hand as opposed to their egos, then it make for a much easier task. It's important. We have to talk about it on the training programs, but I always kind of say, look, if you're sensing that this is not my thing, honestly, as an instructor, then just understand that I had a personal preference to work on my own as and when that was possible. It wasn't the case that if, for example, I was part of a team, I would sort of withdraw and, become a difficult person to work with. It's just that, after so many years of doing it, I've kind of come to the realization that I was someone who preferred working on my own.
Yeah.
But it is an important skill set to have. There's no doubt about that.
So as you've said that many CPOs end up working alone, what would you say the most specific training or mindset shifts are recommended?
In what sense?
For solo operatives. So what would you recommend that mindset or training you teach? Because obviously you say teamwork, but many of you end up working on your own.
Yeah, it's true. So whilst it's true that most CPOs will work one-on-one with the principal, with family, they still have to have the ability to work as part of a team. I think even if it's a sort of shift pattern whereby there's someone working the day shift and you're working the night shift, there's still an element of teamwork there, because you have to sort of recognize that there's someone that you're handing over to, and someone who may be impacted by your work or emissions or, general practices. So there's the teamwork element to that as well. In terms of a mindset, it's, again, everyone has their own preference. I feel although I'm probably the minority in terms of having that preference, I feel like most people would work better as a team. And being part of a team, you can kind of sense that as well. People enjoy, being around other people and the sort of things that go with it, such as, the camaraderie, the banter, the sort of just the general socializing that happens as part of a team. But honestly, generally speaking, you're likely to be working on your own as a CPO. It's just statistics.
Yeah.
I can't statistics.
I can't speak today. And how would you recommend developing negotiation skills with a team, especially when you're dealing with a lot of high personality, strong personalities?
Yeah, that's a difficult skill set. And I think negotiation skills is sometimes misunderstood in its context. So
especially in a high stress situation.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. So I think people immediately, full process, when they hear the word negotiation, they think of something where someone's been kidnapped. We need to negotiate a deal with that individual. Whilst that's not necessarily wrong, in the context of close protection training or any security training, negotiation skills really alludes to this idea of being able to kind of converse with someone with a view of getting something out of it that you want, that's beneficial to your principal. Mm-hmm. So it's not about you, the operative, it's about the principal at the end of the day, and the sort of ease of the operation. So, for example, and this is just a really basic example, if your principal is visiting a really well-known, famous restaurant in Mayfair, somewhere like that, and the restaurant manager doesn't know who the principal is, but they happen to be famous. You want to get the table where they're going to be harassed the least, but also a table of preference for the principal. So you have to go in there and explain that you've got a VIP coming. You can't disclose who it is. It'll become obvious who it is when they arrive. They're an actor, but they want this specific table. Now, obviously, the manager in that example would probably have some reservation, excuse the pun, because they would feel they would feel although they would feel although that you could just be bullshitting, honestly. So that negotiation skills are in it. I suppose we're referring to it in that sense. It's just basically having a conversation with someone, trying to manipulate a scenario in your favor as far as you reasonably can. And so negotiation skills really required that. Again, we go back
to the time I blagged a reservation for saying that I've got some welcome.
Yeah, well, if you're blagging, that's one thing. Or if you've got a similar name to someone who is actually famous, that always can work because you've not lied. That's far and few between, I suppose. But yeah, I think negotiation skills are just on that basis. Like, if you're in a difficult situation, having a conversation, trying to, and I think manipulating someone, I think that has a negative context. But yeah, just trying to get something out of someone, bartering with someone, I suppose you could argue is negotiating. So yeah, that's a really sort of poor example, but it's an example nonetheless of how you converse with someone trying to get something out of it that's beneficial to you and your principal.
And how about let's say like you've got a complex dynamic, like a divorce or something like that. How do you maintain your professionalism when you're dealing with things like this, like communication, managing conflict between them?
Between the parties?
Yeah, or restricted communication.
Yeah, it's
obviously that's part of the teamwork as well.
Yeah, it's difficult. I think if I've actually been in scenarios where separations it has occurred, and there's going to be divorce proceedings later on down the line, and it's not necessarily amicable. So it might be the case that you're with the woman, they're with the guy. Like there's another security team with the husband, and there's negotiation, sort of a discussion that will have to happen between you and the other security team, and naturally the two principals will discuss or not want to discuss. He might want to talk to her, she might not want to talk to him. So all of those kinds of things, I think, at the end of the day, security there to provide a service, and the two security teams should work in theory, in tandem with one another as far as they can, so as to ensure that, look, we want a peaceful outcome. We don't want a big, sort of big scene to occur as a result of what's going on in their personal lives. I think the sort of question that you're alluding to is, how do you manage those situations in terms of managing the conflict? It's, conflict management is a whole topic on its own. When we deliver the conflict management piece on the training programs, it's usually a whole day actually of theory. And then there's a practical element as well. In fact, they have to demonstrate the practical elements that they've learned. So, and there's a lot of psychological elements as well. So it touches upon things like understanding triggers, and it's not triggers in the surveillance sense, what we talked about recently when it comes to memory triggers. It's more what triggers an individual to become angry, or sort of direct them towards a route of becoming sort of heightened, in the sense that they might be more frustrated or whatever. So what you're trying to do ultimately is diffuse frustration, avoid conflict at all costs, and therefore identifying what may be triggering that person, and then implementing what we call inhibitors. So I'll give you a couple of examples, and you'll probably be able to resonate with some of these. So triggers include things like being sworn at, being clocked in, which means someone's like, when you're late for work, for example, everyone looks at their watch and rolls their eyes, that kind of thing, which is not necessarily applicable in terms of close protection. But it's things like being patronized, being patronized and condescended, being rejected, there are things like that. So, I mean, myself, I hate being patronized. I cannot stand it when people starts to simplify their English to talk to me, or slow down and explain things to me really slowly so I can understand it, because they think I'm thick. That really fucking irritates me. So that for me is a trigger. When a trained operative is able to identify what might be triggering that person into frustration, which can then later escalate into something more violent perhaps, then they will use inhibitors. And inhibitors can be things we use basic ones, obviously, and then they're encouraged to sort of use their common sense later down the line. But inhibitors can include things like providing reassurance. If it's really heated, then remind them that there might be legal consequences. So, for example, if someone's showing signs that they may become violent, then it's a case of, look, the police have been called just to let you know, or there's CCTV over there and they're watching everything you're doing. I'm not trying to antagonize you. I'm just letting you know, and it hopefully will encourage them to think about their actions.
Yeah.
Other inhibitors are controversial, such as being outnumbered. So we call it the fear of retaliation. And the idea there is that they will think about, am I actually going to, if they're getting to a point of sort of enforcing the argument with violence, then they will look at their surroundings, see that they're outnumbered, and think, actually, I probably won't win this. For some people, it will do the opposite. It will act as a trigger because they're being antagonized. But for in certain scenarios, and this is where the operative has to assess this dynamically, they have to determine whether or not it's going to act as an inhibitor or a trigger. So it's things like that, basically, to try and kind of calm the situation down. And there are many, many more, but there's no point in listing them all because every situation is different. But ultimately, conflict management, in a nutshell, is being able to identify the level of frustration or the level of anger that they're at. Are they coming too close to me? Are they showing non-verbal communication signs of aggression, which then puts people in danger? And then using the appropriate inhibitors so as to ensure that the situation de-escalates as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
But obviously, when you're delivering it, it's a lot more in depth and detail.
So would you say that relates to the communication protocols that are most effective?
Yeah, I think when in implementing inhibitors is all about communication, positive communication, being able to communicate, being able to resonate and empathize with the scenario will help towards diffusing conflict.
I've written that respect and assertiveness are highlighted a lot in the book as key traits. So how do you coach new operatives to be balanced in real world scenarios?
It's quite easy for security operatives to sort of slide between being assertive and aggressive. It's especially where they've not controlled their adrenaline. They've not really thought about the scenario. It might be that they've been working long hours. It might be that they've not eaten for a long time. And you know what men are like when we don't eat. Which is why, again, which will go back to what we said the other day about women, in some cases are better at handling certain things than men are, and same vice versa. But in those situations, women are very good at this because they know how to remain calm in a conflict situation. Typically speaking, will remain calm and sort of direct the conversation or the situation in the way that they want it to go, whereas men tend to sort of show signs of anger themselves. So it's really difficult, but it's a trained operative will implement a full process that enables them to show assertiveness but not aggression. And aggression is the opposite of aggression, sorry, is passiveness. So passiveness will not work in a conflict situation because ultimately the person will not only think that they've won, and that's not necessarily a bad thing in some situations, but it will encourage the aggressor, as it were, to think that they are able to take it further and they are able to dominate the situation.
How would you get them to gain a level of respect, but obviously not too much authority?
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think it's assertiveness. So not, restrain from showing signs of aggression.
Yeah.
So that men, especially, it's all about body language, and men will recognize, and this is subconscious, by the way. Men will recognize the signs of a man showing aggression from another. So they will be able to perceive danger that way. So men, for example, they will stand up straight. They will increase the size of their back by sort of taking a deep breath, and their shoulders will become bigger. The back will sort of go. They call it peacocking. They will tend to push their chin towards their throat so as to protect their throat, and they will start to start the stance that they will adopt will be more of a balanced one. They might even start losing their speech, but this is all subconscious, right? So men will do this subconsciously, but another man will perceive this as a threat because they reckon. I mean, we're going back to historical, prehistoric times, in sort of caveman eras, where we men used to do things like that so as to protect ourselves and prepare for violence, and it still happens now. But obviously, as a result, the human mind can identify that as danger. So the reason I mention all of this is because it's important that that's still the case. So as a professional, they can see, okay, right, they're starting to prepare for violence. They need to protect themselves, so they may need to prepare themselves for defense, a proportionate defense, but also to implement inhibitors as well, which is, as you said, by way of positive communication, and that's really really important. But with assertiveness, not aggression, not passive. You can't be passive because that's not going to work with someone like that. But with a degree of assertiveness and showing respect at the same time.
And which role would you say which role in the security team is often underestimated?
In what sense? Like in terms of they're undervalued?
Yeah, just underestimated, that people think that it's not like a big role, and probably perhaps is more of a bigger role.
First thing that comes to my mind is in larger teams, team medics, because team medics not only are trained medics, they are EMTs and medical emergency medical technicians or paramedics, or maybe even hold a higher qualification than that. They are also trained in close protection in some cases. So they're performing two roles effectively.
Yeah.
They need to be on top of all the medical equipment. In some cases, they may be carrying spare blood with them in extreme circumstances, right? The blood group that matches that of the principal or the family members, whoever it is they're protecting.
Yeah.
So I think they're underrated in the sense that they're performing a dual role. They need to be at all times ready to deploy their medical equipment and knowledge and practices if there's a scenario kicks up under in a stressful situation potentially. Yeah,
For sure. So you emphasize cross-training role. What challenges do you face when implementing this in real-life operations where teams may be understaffed or over-specialized?
yeah. So in the sense that if, for example, you've got
What is cross-role training?
so I think it's if, for example, in the book and on the course we talk about dual roles. So in a wonderful world, every operative would work as part of a team, a large team where there are drivers, there are medics, there are personal escort section, which is the people that actually surround the principal, as it were, and you've got the search advanced party, the SAP, who go to venues before the principal and they do the research. And then you'll also have an intelligence officer who sits in an office somewhere and collates all the information that the search advanced party are given them from the records that they've conducted. And you'll have all of the sort of incidental intelligence, which is when someone's seen something out of the ground.
So it's a really big team, more than you actually think.
Well, it would be. So in a wonderful world, if you're working for a very wealthy family, it might be like that. The reality is even families that are very wealthy won't have a team that large because honestly, the budget just gets out of hand. So what that means is you have to reduce the amount of team members, but the roles really remain the same. So you have to dual or like adopt more than two roles as a CPO as part of that a smaller team. So if, for example, I'm working with, or we're working with a female principal who has two children. Now there are going to be nannies that's separate from the security team. So ideally, each child would have their own security operative. Yeah. If that's the case, if it's a case that they don't, you have to have one, and it might be the case that they won't pay for an additional driver. So you've got a bodyguard who is the driver as well to those children whilst trying to protect them. And they might be at different, obviously there'll be different ages. So it might be the case one's at nursery, one's at primary school. So you've got all of that to juggle. So that's just one example. But if we talk about someone, an adult male or female, and they're quite proactive in terms of their movements in a central environment, and you've got two bodyguards. That's it. That's the whole security team. Then what one will have to do is one will have to act as the personal escort section, or the main CPO, the one that doesn't leave the principal's side, proverbially speaking. And the other one will have to be the one that goes in advance to the location to conduct a recce to ensure that it's safe for that person to arrive. The difficulty then becomes if there is a serious threat whereby there isn't room given for only one bodyguard to be with the principal, then it presents obviously difficulties because when the principal then says, I need to go to venue X, if that venue hasn't been recce'd, then the team are going to have to sort of struggle with this sort of arrival process where they just don't know what's going on there. They don't know if there's surveillance in place from a hostile threat. They don't know if the venue's safe. They don't know anything about the venue. They don't know the layout of it. They don't know the emergency exits. They don't know where to tell the vehicles to park. So all of these things come into play when there is a limited amount of team members and multitasking, has to take place, and dual roles is a large part of that.
And how often should the security teams practice drills?
I mean,
or conduct drills?
yeah, the thing is, I mean, anyone who's ex-military will tell you that it should be done regularly. The reality is they're stretched time-wise, in my experience. They're stretched. If there is any downtime, a team leader will sort of know in advance, and I suppose you could argue that they would hope to implement drills, appropriate and proportionate drills that may be beneficial should something go wrong. It might even just be basic stuff. It might be fire evacuations, but it should, in theory, be something that's sort of relevant to the threat. I would suggest
Scenario based.
scenario based, yeah, but yeah, scenario based on the threat that's being perceived and assessed. So I would cautiously suggest that it should be done as frequently as possible. But I know that in reality, that's just not likely.
Yeah. And given the importance of the intelligence officer role, I think we just touched on it briefly, how do you ensure that the intel remains current for the movement situations?
So there are two or three ways. One is that let's assume there's a standalone intelligence officer. So one of the ways that we do it at Vanquish is we have a threat research team. So if we have a situation like that, we can actually appoint someone separately in office, not as part of the fixed team out on the ground, who can deal with the intelligence coming in from the team. So answer number one is have one person dedicated to doing constant research, and now with social media and with AI, they can potentially do it quicker.
Yeah.
So they can perceive and then analyze threats in real time. So if for example, someone is discussing the principle online, that can be observed, and we can analyze whether or not that's relevant, and who that person is, and whether or not that's something that should be taken into account. Another example is proactive reconnaissance. So when the team are going from one place to another, like I said a moment ago, making sure that the reconnaissance operations are documented as far as they reasonably can, because in reality, they might not have time. They might have 5 minutes before the principal arrives, so they're not going to have time to write a recce report. But giving general feedback, and the last thing, the third element is incidental intelligence, which is incidental intelligence is something that's recorded information based on something happening out the ground that may or may not be relevant. So it's not necessarily for the incident person, the recorder of the incident, to be knowledgeable or know whether or not that is relevant. It should be up to the intelligence officer. So they, for example, if they've seen someone lingering around the office and the residence of the one of the residences of the principal, then they might take note of it. They might acquire footage and send it back to the intelligence officer, who should then inform the rest of the team. Say, look, this person is a person of interest now. We don't know who they are. We recorded who they are. Sorry, we recorded their appearance at least, and then someone needs to make a decision as to whether or not we need to investigate further. But it also might be the repetition of vehicle appearances. So certain registration numbers keep getting flagged by an automatic number plate registration device that we've got planted somewhere. Some things like that. So all of it, basically, incidental intelligence is where things happen on the ground that is recorded by the operatives, sent back to the intelligence officer, and then they analyze what the right thing is to do next.
Yeah. And what quality do you look for when you're recruiting new team members, particularly for like leadership roles?
So leadership, it's hard, I think, to identify whether or not someone's a leader by way of interviewing and all that kind of stuff. I think people argue with that. I'm not great at HR, honestly. I'm not a great HR person. I would even go a step further and say I'm not even a good people manager. I think I can handle a cohort of people on a training program quite well, but I'm not a good people person, in the sense that I can sort of identify from a group of people who would be best at a certain role. I feel like I'm personally, and I'm only saying this because I feel like it's relevant to the answer. Personally, I feel like I'm good at identifying the qualities of an individual as and when they're presented to me. So, for example, if I meet someone, I get a bad feeling about them. 9 times out of 10, I feel like I'm right. When it comes to identifying qualities of someone who make a good leader, I feel like but I would find that quite difficult to assess. Um, I suppose it's I think one of the things that people don't really think about is that the team have to want to be led by that person. So I guess that's the sort of attribute, and that's a difficult one to assess as well. So if you've got a group of 4 or 5 people working on operation, let's say it's mixed male and female, and you've got sort of 1 or 2 candidates within that group, and you think, who out of these would make a good leader? I personally would ask the team in an open forum and say, look, who out of you would you think would make a better leader? Preferably don't answer yourself. So don't say, I think I would do the best job. So give someone else other than yourself. And I think largely you'll find a sort of clear and collective answer, unanimous almost, to say that it's that person. Because, and if the team are happy with it, then you know it's their decision as well.
Until people are actually in action, who's actually going to take the lead. And in different scenarios, that's the issue. I feel like different people will be good at leading different things, right?
Yeah, I think so. And the funny thing is, academically speaking, from a training environment, you can look at someone and think they would be really good at something, and then you deploy them on a task, and the common sense thing is just it's completely absent, or they do something that surprises you. So you just never know with people. So in that sense, I don't feel I'm the best assessor with that. But I feel like if it's a democratic choice within a team, which is not always possible, but if it is possible, do that.
Yeah.
Because at least then you're not going to get anyone who's sort of, passively unhappy with the scenario.
And then moving on to the next chapter is like communication and interpersonal skills, which obviously is a massive part of what you guys do and what you guys train. And how often do you train CPOs to strike? This is similar questions to what we've had before, but slightly changed, like the right balance between assertiveness and politeness in a high pressure situation.
Yeah, I think with communication and interpersonal skills, they are two different things. They go hand in hand, but they're slightly different. So communication is just about understanding the 3 degrees of communication. So it's spoken words, so verbal communication, the fact that your body language holds a huge amount of weight when it comes to how you come across, and actually the way you say it as well. So for example, when I write a text to someone, I can come across really, really rude, which is why I prefer voice notes. So they were hearing the tone of my voice that I'm not actually trying to be rude. It's just the way that I wrote it. Right, exactly. That's why I always do voice notes.
Like, okay, and it's like, oh god.
Yeah. Or I said to you, don't do this the other day.
Yeah, and you figure everyone's different. Like my response is like, okay, let's do it. Like if you know me, but if not, some of my friends want like 3 kisses to know that I'm okay. And I'm like, that's not me.
Yeah. No, it's how the person perceives it. And I think it depends what mood they're in as well.
100%. Yeah.
So if, for example, you say, okay, so okay could be okay, or it could be okay. So it's totally different. So the tone of voice is really, really important. Now, if the person isn't there, you can't, the non-verbal communication, the body language part is not really relevant. But based on numerous studies, and in the book, there's a pie chart that shows, or pie graph that shows the makeup of communication. Only 5% is the actual words that you use. The rest is tone of voice and body language. So when I'm communicating via telephone or by WhatsApp or whatever, voice note for me is always preferable because I know that I'm going to be perceived, hopefully positively, by the other side. So I think it's important to understand it with communication, right? So when you're part of a team, and or you're talking to your principal, you need to make sure if you're writing a message because you want it to remain formal rather than sending a voice note, which is slightly informal, I think, then you have to write in a way that you know they're going to perceive it. So with communication, in that sense, you have to take into account potentially their culture. You have to take into account sort of the mood they're in, the situation. So there's all of these things that you have to sort of think about before just sending a message really quickly, because again, you do not want to come across rude. Interpersonal skills is slightly different. Interpersonal skills is understanding the difference between one person and another as to in terms of how you would communicate with them. So, for example, I know that I've got one of my friends, he prefers direct, blunt communication.
Yeah.
If I'm speaking to my fiance, she does not like that. So if I speak to her the way I speak to him, she'll get, you're rude. Like, why are you being so rude? Why are you upset with me? Da, da, da. So I think interpersonal skills is really kind of, empathizing with the person's kind of preferences, in the sense that you communicate in the way that you think that they would prefer. And there are other elements to interpersonal skills as well. But yeah, it's really important to understand the makeup of communication, and that actually communication is different to interpersonal skills, but of course they intertwine with one another.
Yeah. And you mentioned non-verbal communication. So how do you make your officers more aware of their body language throughout the course?
Yeah, so non-verbal communication is an extraordinarily interesting area.
Yeah.
It deep dives into psychology quite a bit. I'm not an expert in non-verbal communication. Body language is synonymous with non-verbal communication, by the way. It's just an alternative phrase for it. I am not an expert. I've been trained in it, and I've read up about it. I've read several books about it. The best book, by the way, I'm just going to say this, and I've got no better. No, not my book. It's there's someone called Joe Navarro. He's an ex-FBI agent. He's one of the first people, I think he's at least the first FBI agent to formalize and document his knowledge based on experience and research about nonverbal communication. So yeah, his name's Joe Navarro, sorry, and his book is called What Everybody Is Saying. So
It's a big skill.
it's a really important skill set for close protection operatives. Obviously, we don't have the time to deliver it on a 21-day course because it's very in depth. But the answer to your question is, how do we do it? We make them aware of it. We explain to them very briefly, what it's aware. It's a big part actually of a continuous professional development. I strongly encourage people to study it. And once they're aware of how people perceive others, then they can kind of become sort of slightly more aware. But people do it subconsciously and naturally anyway. So if, for example, I'm in a non-conflict sort of a discussion where there's no conflict, there's no animosity, it's just a normal discussion. There will be approximately 2 to 3 meters between me and the other person, which they call safe space, and my stance will be relaxed. That's gone off. My stance will be relaxed, and there's sort of a general sort of relaxed feeling.
Yeah.
If someone's being aggressive towards me, I need to show that I'm prepared to respond. So that that you automatically know, instinctively, sorry, not automatically, instinctively know how to respond to it. But I think studying body language gives you that additional sort of edge when it comes to displaying the appropriate body language or nonverbal communication.
And what's the most common interpersonal skill that new CPOs struggle with? Would you say? And how would you recommend developing that?
I think it's probably when they are talking to the principal, they're nervous.
Yeah.
I don't know that you can teach people not to be nervous in situations like that. I honestly think it's just experience. I suffered massively with imposter syndrome. I mean, I still do sometimes, feeling like I don't belong in a certain environment. And I think a lot of close protection officers do feel that, honestly.
Surprising.
Yeah, I think it's because, most people in our role come from working class backgrounds and just normal, the normal average Joe, whereas the people you're protecting are not that. They're either extraordinarily wealthy. They may have come from a normal background. Who knows? They may be self-made millionaires or billionaires, but they're either very famous or very, very rich. And I feel like most people, I don't know, I can't speak for everyone, but me, I certainly feel like, oh my God, this is so weird that I'm in, a royal household, or I'm in this massive £50 million home in Hampstead, and I'm talking to the owner of it. And I feel like, part of me, well, not subconsciously, consciously, but in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, oh, this is weird. I shouldn't really belong here. So I think getting over that, understanding that everyone's human. It's
The more relationship and the more experience, like you said, I feel like would build.
definitely, yeah, it's definitely experience. I mean, the more experience you get with it, if you are thrown in the deep end and you're forced to work with ultra high net worths, and then the next thing you know, you're dealing with a celebrity that's not an A-lister, as it were, then you'll probably be more confident than the other way around. And I think it's just experience, I think.
And from your personal career and experience, is there any situations where your interpersonal skills have saved or relieved outcome, or like embarrassing outcome for anyone?
Yeah,
How you
possibly.
use them?
I think the first sort of example that jumps to my mind is that with paparazzi and things like that. So with the paparazzi, I was working in the celebrity environment for quite a long time, and you get to know the same faces, they get to know you. Some will like you, some won't, same vice versa. But if you build a positive relationship up with them, because they can be very difficult. There's lots of them, and they will push and shove as much as they can to get what they want. I feel like if you build up a good, positive working relationship with them, then you can negotiate a situation where, look, I will walk with when yeah, and this is God's honest truth. So sometimes it'll be a case of, look, we know what you want. You want your shot, right? So what we'll do, I will stand on this side as long as you can promise you will stand there on that side, or if there's no barrier, just if you can remain in to some degree there,
Yeah.
I will walk on this side so you get your shot, right? So I'm not going to block your view between the person and me. And I know a lot of close protection operatives will be like, you should be between yourself, the danger, and the principal. The bodyguard is supposed to be there, right? Rather than the other side. But really, they're paps. They're not going to cause that much havoc.
Yeah.
Right? So if that's the case that they agreed to that, then that is really good, positive negotiation skills, utilizing interpersonal skills as well to get what you want. And they get what they want, you get what you want, everyone's happy. Always aim for a win-win. If they don't want to play ball, then it's going to be more difficult. It's a case of you having to minimize the time that the principal is going from the building to the vehicle, as an example, and you will walk between them and the principal, so their shots are, to some extent compromised, and then there's a minimum amount of time of the subject being out on the ground for them to get their photos off. So it's just little things like that. That's just one silly example I can think of.
And what would you say that why does the security industry just have a negative reputation?
I think it's largely because of bad actors. Not actors in the actor sense, in terms of people performing in a way that's aggressive. I think it's so. I think largely when you say security, people's mind automatically largely jump to doorman, right? And everyone's had a bad experience with a doorman who hasn't, rude, aggressive, job's worth, overconfident, cocky, usually wrong, by the way, legally speaking, which is what we talked about the other day. But and this is not all doormen, by the way, because there are a lot of doormen are unbelievable. You've been you know Manchester quite well, right? Do you know? I'll give you a really good example of doorman. Have you been to Albert Schloss?
Yes.
Right, the doorman there. It's a security company called FGH Security.
Yeah.
They are probably the most professional door supervisors you'll ever get anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
They're unbelievable. They're polite. They're professional, but they're capable as well.
In a way, but I've just seen it slightly cross over a little bit too much. But then obviously, well, you can't say this because I believe if you go to work on a brave face, you could have been having a bad day or this, that, that shouldn't have been the case.
Everyone has bad experience, like we said, with door supervisors. I mean, I think that's why the security industry as a whole has a bad reputation. Before it was regulated in the UK, and this still happens in Australia, even though it is regulated, door supervisors will become bodyguards. That was, and also it wasn't even because there was no crossover, there was no boundary between the two. You could be a door supervisor one night, unlicensed, because there was no license, and then be a bodyguard to someone the next day. So there was this kind of, people still get this word sort of mixed up, the word bouncer. So people will associate the word bouncer with bodyguard, and it's wrong. And it's only wrong in the sense that a bouncer typically is associated with a door supervisor, and a bodyguard is a bodyguard. They're two different things entirely. Now it's the lines are drawn between the two by way of licensing and training, which is massively different. So what I suppose we and other companies like Vanquish have tried to do over the last sort of 15 years or so is try to get the public perception to move away from big bodyguard door supervisor type to professional close protection officer, intelligence led, intelligence acquisition, utilizing individual who's capable still of physically protecting the individual.
Would gain a lot more respect anyway, because like we were saying, the impression people have got the negative, and it's because of the doorman, started doorman, and it's always usually, this sounds rude if not, but it's usually the big ones or whatever that have got a bit of an ego, and that's obviously eating their reputation, whereas you're probably a lot more respected if you are
exactly
more normal looking.
If people act professionally, then they will get the respect that they deserve. Unfortunately, that's not always the case.
And how should a close protection officer handle a principal who is uncooperative or dismissive in the security team?
It happens a lot. I've had it a few times. It's very, very difficult, but positive lines of communication as far as you reasonably can, and negotiation skills. If the principal's not giving you what you want, then you're going to have to negotiate with them as far as you can. If it's a situation where the principal is just too difficult to work with, then you have to make a call. The close protection operative has to make a call whether or not this is a tenable relationship. A relationship in the sense, a working relationship I'm talking about, whether or not long term they're going to be able to proactively protect this person based on their behavior, on the levels of cooperation that they're showing or lack thereof. It's a difficult call. I've honestly had to stop working with someone because they just would not cooperate. They spoke to me like I was a complete idiot. They would not. They had no respect for the work I did. None at all. I'm telling you to do this. You don't. And then don't call me by. So I was introduced to this person by their first name. So naturally, I addressed them by their first name. And then the person who introduced me to them received a text, and then I received a text from them. So rather than that person tell me how they would prefer to be addressed, they went through a third party to say, do not call this person their name, call them by this. So which is a bit,
that would already put you on edge as well. Like, okay, there's no relationship there.
Exactly. And it's a bit of a strange thing to do anyway, no matter what position you hold or how wealthy you are, or what your rank is within a certain office. It's just a strange thing to do. But continuing to kind of put barriers in your way and things like that. And by the way, it's not always the principal. This is the interesting thing. It's not always the principal. It's someone that the principal works with. So it might be, if it's a singer or an actor. It might be their talent manager. Sorry, it might be the PR agent that's representing them temporarily. They might put barriers in your way to doing your job. So again, there needs to be a professional conversation where you have to be assertive, put your foot down, as it were, but not too aggressive. Obviously, say, look, this is the situation. Explain the situation to them and tell them why you're not able to do your job. And again, if it's untenable, then it's up to the close protection officer
And I can imagine
to make a call.
The principals are under the influence, them environments are always difficult.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a situation where they're under the influence of drugs or alcohol, then if it's a one-off, it's a one-off. I've had situations like that, but I had a good relationship with them in the first place. So they're drunk and they're all over the place, and you just have to handle those situations. That's just part of it, honestly. But if they're drunk and they're being aggressive and all the rest of it, again, that might be a case of you having to really assert your authority and you know putting your foot down and saying, no, we're now drawing this to a close and we're leaving. But to get to that position, once again, requires a lot of positive communication and interpersonal skills, because in order for you to affect that properly is going to be quite difficult if you don't know them that well.
Sure. And in the book, you mentioned that some operatives act like a principal.
Yeah.
How do you coach this in professionalism?
Well, I'll just give the example. I think it's far and few between. I had a colleague once who was a close protection officer, and he would speak to the staff, the household staff, like he was in charge, and he wasn't. And he would, honestly, I mean, he would the things he would ask the maids and things to do was just completely inappropriate, in the sense that it was almost as they were working for him, and he was. It's like we're all working. We were all effectively household staff. Yeah, I mean, okay, that woman there is taking care of the cleaning. You're taking care of the security, but you're all household staff. There's no hierarchy here, and there might be, and even if there is, and you are at the top of that hierarchical chain, it doesn't matter. It's the way you treat people, I think, is important. I think largely most people are not adverse to that. It's just there are a few examples of people that will do, and I don't think you can teach that. I just think it's how people are.
And you talk about a lot about radio, using radios, right? It's a massive part of communication.
Yeah.
So it's very precise. So what are common mistakes operatives make when they're using radios?
I think when they're using two-way radios, there are protocols that should be adhered to. In theory, in practice, I've got to be honest. If you're working as part of a team for a long period of time, the chances of those protocols maintaining a high standard are very, very slim. They're going to go down the pan here and there. They're going to be code words that are used to sort of.
But when I was reading it, I was shocked that it's actually not. Obviously, in films, it even says over and out, but it's not. It's just over.
Yeah, so there's a misconception. Yeah, so when you say over, you're waiting for a response. When you say out, that's when the person is telling you the conversation's finished. Don't respond. Yeah. Actually, what they're saying is don't respond to me, because in theory they need to use the communication line for someone else.
Yeah.
So they might even say out to you, and that means you do not talk anymore. I'm finished with you, and then they'll call the next person on the same network.
My friends, I need to say this to certain people that I don't want to.
Yeah.
Out. No conversation.
Out. Yeah. No, over and out is a misconception. I think largely comes from American films, and I don't even think the American armed forces say over and out. I don't know where that's come from, other than Hollywood.
It's like over and out. Yeah.
Over and out. It's not a thing. It's completely inaccurate. That is the biggest mistake, and it's quite annoying. But
how do you address? Say if someone has said something wrong on a radio or this, that, and the other, like, how do you address these situations? Is it just one of them things?
To be honest with you, if they're not ex-military or ex-police, or actually the military and the police, they do use different protocols sometimes. I don't think it's that important. Personally, I'm quite chill. I'm quite laid back. As long as you understand what you understand what the person's saying, or that the person's going to understand what you're trying to get across, and there's no room for miscommunication. So use the phonetic alphabet when possible. Always use the phonetic alphabet when necessary, so as to avoid mistakes. Use the 24-hour clock so that you don't get time is mixed up, which is unlikely because two-way radios only last for a certain amount of time anyway. So it's things like that. I think certain protocols should be adhered to, so as to avoid confusion. But I mean, honestly, if you've got someone who's ex-civilian police officer and he's working with someone who's ex-military, they're going to say different things. I can't think of examples, but they're slightly more formalized. Beg your pardon. They're slightly less informal in the police than the military, slightly. But it doesn't matter. I think if they're on, if English is their first language, the likelihood of confusion is quite slim.
Yeah. And then explain to us, and you talk about walking drills. What are walking drills?
Well, walking drills. So walking drills is the theory of how personal escort section should position themselves when with a principal.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to put a side note into this, and it's a caveat, right? In reality, and this is God's honest truth, I don't think walking drills are adhered to as much as the theory would have you think.
Yeah.
However, because the criteria of training programs are set out by the authorities, you have to teach what those walking drills are. And some will have certain benefits. So a box method is quite self-explanatory. It's where the principal's in the middle, and at each corner there's an operative, and each operative will have what we call their arcs of responsibilities. So they imagine, well, actually, everyone should have a 360 responsibility, right? So if everyone's covering 360, so they're looking around as much as they reasonably can. The front two are using their reflections, or reflections to look behind them. There are counter arguments to that they should be responsible for the front, and the ones at the rear should be responsible for the rear, and obviously ones at the front right should be sort of a 90-degree responsibility, and vice versa. And then the other theory is that everyone's arcs of responsibilities cross over each other, so that everything's cross-checked, as it were. And that looks really wonderful when you're drawing on a whiteboard or in a book, but in reality, it's not always adhered to. And one of the misconceptions is that when we're doing it out on the ground, we have to implement it and video it for the evidence so that the person can get the qualification. It's called portfolio building. So when they're doing the sort of box method or the diamond method, which is self-explanatory, is like the box method, but switched around slightly. So they've got one person at the front, two at the sides, one at the rear. When you're doing these drills, so you've got the principal in the middle, you've still got the bodyguard next to the principal, by the way. So it's a box, but you've got two people inside the box. One is the close protection operative, and the principal. But the misconception is when you're walking through a busy environment, a CBD somewhere, like I don't know whether it's in London or Sydney or whatever it is, on the course, people tend to think that they're not allowed to let people in that box.
Yeah.
Which is a bit of a misconception. In an ideal world, people would not come near your principal, and then you've got less to worry about. But in reality, you can't do that. You can't force the public to do something they don't want to do. You haven't got the right to do that. You don't have the authority to do that. So the sort of sub theory is that you assess everyone that's approaching the proverbial box and say, does that person match the profile of someone that we've done research on? Or do they look like they're a potential aggressor? Do they look like they may be concealing a weapon? All those kinds of things, right? If it's a little old lady walking toward that, you can't like try and physically force her out. It's just not going to work. So there's all of those factors that come into play. That's something that happens a lot on the course. But and I'll give you another example of where the theory of walking drills can be beneficial. So there's something called an open V and a closed V. An open V is where you have the principal in the middle and two people either side, a couple of people slightly further back, and then one at the rear. That's a V formation with the principal in the middle. And the idea is that that's all well and good when the public are secured in a stadium, perhaps, or there's barriers there, and they want to be able to see the principal, but there's potentially a danger from the rear. And the other one is the closed V, where it's the opposite. It's like a V in the front of the principal. In the military, they might call it an arrowhead formation. So they're walking like in a sort of pointy shape with the principal sort of somewhere in the middle. And that, in theory, is good for when you're trying to get through crowds.
Yeah.
Once again, though, and I just want to say this and make this very, very clear, that in reality, you don't really tend to stick to them.
No.
For two reasons. One is because you're likely to be just working one-on-one or two-on-two, and you just change it dynamically. And the second reason is that there's so many other things that come into play. You're not likely to walk down the street unless you're working with a politician or something, and there are some additional controls around the principal, then they're just not likely to take place.
Yeah. So it's more about, would you say it's more about judging the scenario and principle that you have when the walking drills come to play or not?
Yeah, I think so. And also dynamically out on the ground, how busy is the environment? Does anyone even know who your principal is? Because if they don't, why attract attention? You're going to draw attention. It's unnecessary. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And they're going to be looking at you rather than the principal as well. By the way, especially if you've got comms in, and someone notices the curly whirly in your ear, you're like, who's that? Because they've seen a bodyguard. Now they're trying to identify who the person is. You probably don't want that. So walking drills will only make that worse if it's really formalized.
Yeah. And it's actually weird that you say that people notice, because I remember I was actually on a night out in Dubai before in South Club, and I noticed in this big crowd a guy with an earpiece in.
Yeah.
And I could not stop telling everyone there's a guy with an earpiece. So like, what is he actually doing in the middle of
Yeah. And there's probably someone, in that crowd that they're keeping an eye on. So he's trying to be discreet, but the earpiece is giving him away. Yeah. And that, again, that just draws unnecessary attention. But sometimes, honestly, you can't avoid that. So if you are working with someone who's famous and you're working with another operative, there's two of you, you are going to need to communicate quickly. And two-way comms is the best way to do that because it's instantaneous.
So WhatsApp chats, would you use WhatsApp chats as well or no?
It distracts you from eyes on the principal. It depends on the situation, honestly. If for example, the principal's safe, they're in the office and you're outside, you can communicate or WhatsApp call and all the rest of it. Obviously in Dubai, you can't do WhatsApp calls.
No.
Or in the UAE. So two-way radios in some situations are beneficial, especially, so if you're in a club or a bar or restaurant and you need instant communication, sometimes there's a delay with the person responding. And if you're writing the text or having to unlock your phone, everything, it's taking eyes off the principal or the people surrounding the principal, which can be a risk in front of what we've done.
Yeah. So what are the main roles within a security team?
It's hard for me to remember off the top of my head, honestly. But generally speaking, and this is in an ideal world scenario, there is the team leader who's in control of the whole team. So they manage everything from discussions from the principal to the team. So what will happen during the next working period, as it were. An intelligence officer, which is the person who's obviously responsible for collating, potentially analyzing the intelligence as well, which is formed in two parts, which we'll discuss another time. Then you have the second in command. Sometimes the second in command is the intelligence officer, or vice versa. The second in command basically works one under the team leader. It's also referred as the 2IC. So they will be like a sub team leader, if you like. And then you have search advanced party, which are the people or person who will go ahead to venues and locations prior to the principal's arrival to ensure that it's safe, and they will conduct security reconnaissance, which is quite a long and in-depth thing, which we'll probably talk about another time. And then you have the personal escort section, which are the operatives that will be around the principal. But usually there will be one main bodyguard. That's sometimes the team leader. It might be the 2IC. They're the ones that are usually next to the principal at all times. The personal escort section are the additional bodies who are surrounding the principal, whether it be in a diamond formation or whatever it is, whatever the sort of formalities they decide to adopt. And then it depends on the situation, but in an ideal world, there'd be a medic who's also a CPO. So he might form she might form the role of team medic as well as a personal escort section. It'd be unlikely, for example, that the medic would be search advanced party because they would then be away from the principal for potentially prolonged periods of time, which could be subject. So there's that. And then drivers, if drivers are part of the security team, ideally they would be, but if not, we can perhaps try and get the chauffeurs more trained to a level where they're more confident in terms of security protocols, not driving, not security driving. That is a totally different thing. Maybe they will do security driving later on, but that's a different topic. But things like being more aware, act as an extra set of eyes, so as to observe, repetitive faces, the repetition of different vehicles approaching the property or being near the property or whatever it is. Teaching them in some aspects of surveillance so they could be more aware about or conscious of counter surveillance and things like that. So those are generally the team members. But as we were saying before, we'll talk about in more depth. It's hard for some people to kind of get their heads around this, but a lot of teams they perform dual roles so as to minimize the amount of operatives that are actually on the task. So it'd be the team leaders, also the close protection officer, and it'll be the 2ICs, also the intelligence officer. And it makes sense because then they have kind of divided responsibilities in terms of operatives. So the CPO, who's always with the principal, will be in charge of the personal escort section. That makes sense because they're in direct contact. They're always there.
So the communication flows through the whole group or flows separately through little parts of the group?
It depends. I mean, everyone should be communicating proactively and positively. But what I was trying to get at is because the team leader is always with the principal, and so are the personal escort section, they would be responsible for that team.
Okay.
The team leader is ultimately responsible for everything, but he will delegate the role of the search advance to the 2IC.
Many teams within the team.
Exactly, yeah. So the 2IC is also the intelligence officer, and that makes sense of them being in charge of the search advanced party operatives because they're the ones that are really going out to do the research or recce's, if you like, research is basically intelligence gathering. So that intelligence gathering then goes back to the 2IC, who's also the intelligence officer. So we've kind of ruled out about 3 or 4 different roles there that combined 4 different roles effectively in a really compatible and effective way, and minimizing costs, because really it's all about money. Let's be honest, someone's having to pay for this somewhere. So if you can minimize costs whilst not compromising the protection effort, then perfect.
And I suppose it's really hard because what if you have a CPO that's everyone underneath is not liking, but he's the guy in charge? Who's then responsible? And if the principal gets under the CPO, who's then responsible? If it's just you have to sit up and get on with it, or
Well, then that would suggest that he's a bad leader or she's a bad leader, because and that's why I said before. I think, in terms of selecting a leader as part of a group, it shouldn't always be, but a democratic option is pretty good in the sense that you get the sort of 5 or 6 team members and say, look, who do you think would be the best team leader? And I think usually they would all point to one person, and they think that because they prefer them, they prefer the way they delegate, they know that they're a decent person, and they like their ability to lead. So, um, I think that's probably the better option. If you go into a scenario where there's already a team leader appointed and they're just rude, then they're not a great leader, and so that's going to have consequences further down the line, I think.
yeah. That's all for today. Thank you for joining us on this episode discussing the book, The Art of Protection, and we look forward to you joining us again next time.